This mix covers other laws that are perhaps discipline-specific that each of you should perhaps browse through. This is a slightly longer mix than the others because there are discipline-specific topics. So if there is a topic that isn't relevant to your discipline, you can certainly skip that section, but it's worth reviewing to make sure that you've seen the material relevant to your current or potentially future disciplines. One of the best places to start is actually the Professional Engineers Ontario page, which actually lists 34 other Ontario engineering regulations beyond the ones that we've already discussed this course. Some of these regulations are discipline specific, some of them highlighted in red have a generic application to pretty much every engineering discipline. There are 32 documents covering a number of different types of activity and 2 performance standards. In a number of fields, it's necessary to consider privacy laws. I've provided the links to 2 privacy sites. The first one is the Government of Canada Privacy Law page, and the second provides a useful link to privacy laws. There are 2 key federal privacy laws, the Privacy Act, which basically covers governmental handling of personal information, and PIPEDA, which covers any private sector handling of information that should be considered private. There are a number of cases where people will have to handle information that will be considered private for pretty much any engineering discipline. In addition to the federal laws, there are 3 provincial laws in Ontario. The so-called Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, its municipal equivalent, which acts for local government, and the Personal Health Information Protection Act, all of which relate to information stored and managed by provincial, local, or health services government divisions. Personal information covers a wide definition of things, including your name, opinions that you might have, opinions that people might have about you, your political affiliations, any imagery that is captured around you. And so personal information is something that you have the right to know is being stored in a safe way. You have the right to know what's being stored about you, and so on and so forth. Again, a number of you will end up having to handle material that is covered under the Security of Information Act as an engineer. You'll be surprised perhaps at the level of entry for this, which basically covers some of the personal information we've just talked about. If you have any information that is covered under the Security of Information Act that you shouldn't have in some way, either that you've obtained in contravention of this Act, or that you've been given correctly, and then you communicate it with somebody who you shouldn't, use it in a way that helps a foreign power, keep the information when you should have given it back, or fail to actually keep it safely under control, then you may be sent to prison for between 2 years and life. So under the Security of Information Act, the lowest level is so-called protected. And it's interesting to note that protected information covers material that could cause injury at a non-national interest level. So it could cause injury to a person or an organization. So protected A or B can include information about an individual's name, date of birth. B might be more around things like social security numbers or things that people could use to defraud somebody. And protected C is then dealing with material that could cause an organization to have serious financial issues or cause a significant injury to a person. When we think about secure information, perhaps the more traditional classifications people think about are classified and higher. Protected, however, is a significant and the largest component of secure information in Canada. So the order of classification for sensitive information that could affect national interest is classified, confidential, secret, and then top secret. In order to be given access to information that's covered in these acts, you have to have something called a reliability status, or if you're a company, a designated organization screening. This gives you access to protected A, B, and C information. If you want access to higher levels, confidential, secret, or top secret, an individual requires a personnel screening clearance, which typically involves interviews and background checks that are quite extensive. And a facility requires a facility security screening, which includes checking the security measures in place to protect the material that would be covered by those clearances. There are other screening checks that can apply, document safeguarding capability to allow you to store information, the ability to produce secure information, some specific checks for handling IT security, and NATO clearance if you want to work in Canadian projects that also interface to other North Atlantic Treaty partner countries. The next one deals with arms control, and whilst there may not be many of you in the room who are thinking about working in a defence field, there are materials that are covered by the arms control that a number of you will be working with in your careers. Clearly there's a desire to limit access to weapons, whether nuclear, chemical, biological, or traditional. There are specific laws around not having weapons in space and non-proliferation. However, there is a group of technologies called dual use, which can actually have benign uses, but could also be used for some of these weapons that many of you may end up touching without any involvement in arms development. It's perhaps interesting to reflect on the fact that the people who are defining these treaties are the people who have created these weapons in the first place, quite often. So dual use, at its simple definition, is taking a product that was designed for one purpose and using it for another, as in this Lego brick example that I thought was quite fun. However, dual use in an arms-related context consists of technologies that could have both a peaceful and military use. And this can be something as benign as a magnet or a certain grade of bearing. Clearly it also includes things like navigation systems or attitude control or guidance systems that can be used in perfectly peaceful purposes but could be used for military or non-peaceful uses, and therefore there are controls over who has access to those materials. Export controls in Canada are covered by a department called DFATE. They will make sure that anything with a potential dual use, anything that does have a clear military use, or nuclear materials, or even certain drugs are controlled. In order to handle things that are listed on that control list, an organization has to be registered with the Controlled Goods Program, and here at York we are registered. So, for example, in the Space Engineering Group, there are occasionally materials that get covered by dual use that have to be handled under controlled goods. So when we think about export, it's perhaps traditional to think about exporting things, but knowledge is also exportable. So even if we help somebody or describe how a technology works, or we have a document, that could be considered an exportable good, and so it has to be handled carefully. In particular, if we think about today's world where we use electronic means for sharing documents, if we access those documents overseas, that can be considered as exporting the document. It makes it accessible to the foreign power that if the information in that document is considered dual use, could potentially be used for non-peaceful purposes. So if you were to consider registering for a control goods program, in addition to having the company registered, the goods that you are actually maintaining that are on that list have to be managed, who has access to them, where they have to be stored in places that are controlled as well. And the employees have to fill in a so-called security assessment application. If you look at the questions on that, they go into a lot of detail about where you've lived, where you've been, where you've travelled, a lot of personal information that a lot of people can be uncomfortable sharing, but that's the expectation that the Canadian government has in order to have access to control goods. Software clearly plays a growing role in most engineering disciplines. However, when we develop software, there are a number of issues we need to think about. First is maintaining data privacy, making sure that information either about the individuals using the software or about the products being developed by the companies using software is not made available through some leak or some error in the coding. In terms of warranties and liabilities, typically companies make very clear statements about what their liability is if somebody relies on calculations from their tools. But this is clearly very important, because if an engineer is relying on a piece of software to calculate something correctly and it doesn't, and the consequence is serious, then the software company maybe has some implication in that. Dealing with software that can cross borders, either internet-based or software that has access online, have issues around export control because of that fact that international borders are very easy to cross in a digital world. And a couple of other areas to think about are when we're using code. There are a lot of laws governing the intellectual property around code reuse. And when dealing with open source software, some of the licensing terms of open source software require that the tools that use that themselves are open use. So all these rules have to be taken into consideration around the area of software. A good starting point for some of the issues around software intellectual property is provided in the following two links. I do recommend you read those if you want to dive deeper. The concept behind internet neutrality is that people should be able to access all information on the internet equally. We know that in certain countries there are very heavy blocks on certain information coming into the country. But even in Canada, there are certain sites that have data from them controlled in terms of how much information can be streamed from certain sites. And that's seen as censorship. And the concept behind internet neutrality is to allow all sites to be accessed at the same rate, with no throttling, with no censorship of any specific information. When thinking about geospatial information, the largest provider of this is currently Google Earth. People use this widely for a number of reasons, but it does have certain biases in its searching. So thinking about net neutrality in a Google Earth context, the equality of information that such services provide is clearly able to be questioned, and perhaps should be. Another issue that's been raised on services such as Google Earth is whether they in some way could be seen to violate national rights over knowledge of their own infrastructure and so on. It's interesting to look back in history when, during the Cold War, the fact that both the Russians and the Americans were able to get very high-resolution imagery of each other through spy planes and so on really allowed the Cold War situation to change, because where both sides were actually aware of what each other were doing, there was no longer the ability to act stealthily and cause a real problem. And through understanding how each other behaved and acted, there were a lot more security controls in place, and the risk of something growing out of control was perhaps lessened. So it's interesting to reflect on what that might mean in today's world with a private entity like Google Earth providing similar types of information. There are nonetheless controls over what you're allowed to do from a space-based platform for sensing the Earth. In Canada, the RSSA basically covers the laws around accessing, controlling, using, disseminating information from a space platform without a license. And basically the license is given by the government, allowing Canada to override commanding of that space platform. With regard to space law, there are some interesting principles. The United Nations has defined principles around the use of space for freedom of exploration for the well-being of all countries and humankind. And there are concepts in space law around avoiding damage, not using space for military purposes, how countries are expected to help each other in terms of rescuing spacecraft or people, and ensuring that people don't interfere with each other when using assets in space, and how those space assets might affect the environment below. Space law, however, is perhaps overdue for an update in light of the large number of commercial activities now in space, where commercial entities may cross national boundaries, and the activities that are happening in space perhaps extend beyond those originally considered. If we think about things like mining for collecting fuels, who gets those rights, how are those rights managed internationally? If we think about things like space tourism, what regulations would apply to being on board a vehicle in space, and if we use space platforms to collect power and transmit it to the ground, again, who's responsible, who's liable, what are the laws that should govern that?